Today's daf we're going to learn is Yevamot daf Ayin Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Lori Shulden Ashur on the occasion of the 50th year at site of her father, Raphael ben Brendel Avraham Yaakov, and to celebrate the medical school graduation of her daughter, Dr. Shena Shiur. Mazel tov. Today's daf is sponsored by Joanna Ram in honor of Adrian's birthday. Happy special birthday to my cherished longtime friend and now chavrita Adrian. May you continue to go from strength to strength. Okay, we're going to get started. Right now, we have one very small thing to finish up from our discussion yesterday. Okay, starting from the middle of Ayin Bet Amud Bet, Rabbi Elazar had said, Arel sheizat sa'atok shera. Right, we've been dealing since the beginning of the chapter with the Arel, an uncircumcised person. We're going to continue to get into that, an uncircumcised male. What kinds of things are they allowed to do, not allowed to do? So we started with the can't eat truma. We learned it from Pesach, or maybe we learned it from Ish, that he's like a tameh. That was the difference for Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. Now Rabbi Elazar comes and says that what about the laws of para aduma, the red heifer? Yes, in fact, they could sprinkle the red heifer waters. Where do we get this from? Midi dehavia tful yom. Just like a tful yom, since a tful yom is someone who went to the mikveh in the morning or sometime during the day, but is waiting for the sunset. So they're in between. They're not fully pure, but they're not fully impure because they've gone to the mikveh. They just haven't waited for the sun to set. So now they say, right then, on yesterday's daf, we said, Afal pisha asur b'truma, right? A tful yom can't eat truma, that we know, because they have to wait until the sun sets to eat truma. And yet they're kasher b'para. They can do the para aduma. So likewise, the Arel can't eat truma, but can sprinkle the para aduma waters. Sorry, I don't know what I said before, but they can sprinkle the waters. So now, what we didn't discuss yesterday, but yesterday we got into a discussion about that, is where our daf starts, which is how do we know that a tful yom is allowed to sprinkle the para aduma waters? And this, I told you, is a famous machloket we've seen a few times already between the Prushim and the Tzdukim. You'll see now where the Prushim get it from, that a tful yom can do it, right? It became such a big debate, and there was so much tension between the groups that they would make sure someone became a tful yom in order to do the para adumas to kind of show the Tzdukim that they were wrong. So now it says at the beginning of our daf, V'hizah hatahor ala tameh. Now we're going to learn in the pasuk of the sprinkling. It says, Hizah hatahor ala tameh. The pure person will sprinkle the waters on the impure person. Remember, the whole idea of the para aduma waters is to purify someone. So we take a pure person to sprinkle on the impure person. Now you might not have thought what the Gemara is going to say from this. You would have thought, okay, that means tahor, completely tahor person, sprinkles on the completely tameh person. But they don't understand it that way. They say tahor, Michlal shehu tameh. From here, you can derive that the tahor person must be somewhat tameh. How do they get this exactly? So it's a good question. What it seems to say is, first of all, you didn't necessarily need to say hatahor. Obviously, you're talking about a tahor person who's dealing with it, and tahor is mentioned a bunch of times in that section. But it seems to be saying you're tahor for this, but you're not necessarily tahor for other things. So they're calling him the tahor. Normally, regular person would. Normally, you need to say tameh, as opposed to, if they're not tameh, you know they're obviously tahor. So the fact that they specifically specify tahor must mean they're pure for this, but they might not be pure for everything. What's that? Tful yom, because he's someone or she's someone who has gone to the mikveh, so they're somewhat pure. They can do certain things, but they're not allowed to do everything. So that's what we derive from here. Limed al tful yom shekasher b'para. From here, and now you can see why the Tzdukim disagree with them, right? Because it's clearly a drasha from the pasuk, and it's not the simple reading of that verse, and that's why the Tzdukim don't have that interpretation. Okay, now we're going to basically get off on another topic that's going to take us through the entire daf, which is a question they asked Rav Sheshet. From here, we're going to get off on a bit of a tangent. Ba'u minei Rav Sheshet. Arel mahu b'maaser. So we've been talking about Arel b'Pesach. We talked about Arel b'Truma, right? And those two, the Arel can't be involved in eating the Korban Pesach. Can't eat Truma, right? We're talking about a Jew who couldn't be circumcised for whatever reason or didn't, whatever it is, even if it's a legitimate excuse, they can't do certain things. Question is, can they eat maaser sheni? Let's remember what maaser sheni is. On years 1, 2, 4, and 5, after you take your truma from your produce, then you take your maaser for the Levi, a tenth for the Levi. You then take a tenth of what's left and you bring it to Jerusalem. Okay, that's maaser sheni. In years 3 and 6, you do for the poor people. Let's say maaser goes to the poor people, and in year 7, you don't do it at all. So now, right, Shemitah year. So now, in years 1, 2, 4, and 5, you bring those fruits to Jerusalem, and you have to eat them in Jerusalem. If you can't schlep them to Jerusalem, it's too far, you can redeem them onto a coin and bring the coin to Jerusalem and use it to buy food, any kind of food, sacrifices, fruits, it doesn't matter, and you have to eat them in Jerusalem. So Rav Sheshet wants to know, now, maaser sheni is always kind of in between. It's got certain sanctity to it, but it's not exactly. There's a debate. Is it considered your food or is it God's food? Is it mamon gavoa, mamon hediot? What's its status? So there's always a little bit of a debate about it. So the question is, can an arel eat maaser? Is that something is it like truma, right? It's not exactly like truma because it doesn't go to the kohen, it's your own, you get to eat it. But how much of it is it yours or is it sanctified? So that's really the question. Now, here comes his question, the question they asked Rav Sheshet. Here are the two sides. We made a reference to this a few days ago, which is Pesach. Okay, maaser, one of the unique things about maaser is in year 4 and year 7 of the Shemitah cycle, around Pesach, right? I think it's just before Pesach. You say, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's right around then. You say what's called vidoy maaser. You basically, and it's biur maaser. You get rid of any maaser you still have in your house. You have to destroy it. And you say this declaration. So you say, and one of the things you say in the declaration is, lo achalti, we'll see some of them today, lo achalti be'oni mimenu. I didn't eat the maaser when I was in onen. You say this kind of declaration that says, I didn't do this, I didn't do this, I did everything properly. So one of the things you say, I didn't eat it when I was in onen. From there they know you can't eat it when you're in onen. From there, it's not exactly clear how, but from there they derive to Pesach. Just like maaser, also Pesach. That was the whole question, why we didn't learn aninu from Pesach, because we said, well, you're not going to learn truma. Remember, truma in onen is allowed to eat it, and they learned it from kol zar lo yochal. Only if you're a stranger, but if you're a kohen who's an onen, you're allowed to eat. And then they said, why'd you learn this and not that? And they said, well, we weren't going to derive that from Pesach because Pesach, it's only derived from maaser. It's not actually explicit in the Torah that you can't eat, that an onen is not allowed to eat on the korban Pesach. So therefore, they say, so here they're making reference to that drasha. The same way we learned onen from maaser to Pesach, maybe we should learn arel from Pesach to maaser, right? If it goes both ways. Now, drasha sometimes go both ways and sometimes don't. It depends kind of how they're learned out. If they're learned by Gzera Shava, the same words appear, then usually we learn it both ways. If they're learned by a hekesh, maybe you could say both ways, right? Similar words appear similar places, or next to each other, sorry. But if you learn it from a kal v'chomer, like one is more strict, one is more lenient and yet has a strict law, then the one that's more strict obviously is going to have that law. Then it doesn't go both ways, obviously. So it seems like there's a little bit of lack of clarity as to how exactly it's derived. So that's why they say, do we say the same way we learn by Pesach from maaser linyan aninut, yalif nami maaser mi Pesach linyan arilut? Do we say it goes both ways? We can learn from maaser to Pesach. We can learn from Pesach to maaser. O dilma, or possibly chamor mikal yalif kal mi chamor lo yalif. We can learn something that's more strict, like Pesach, we can learn from maaser, which is more lenient. If we're going to be lenient, if maaser is more lenient and we can't eat it when we're in onen, then obviously Pesach, which is more strict, you can't eat it when you're in onen. But kal mi chamor lo yalif. But we can't say if Pesach is very strict and an arel can't eat korban Pesach, an uncircumcised male, well, you can't necessarily learn and say, well, maaser, which is more lenient, we're going to have the same strict rules. It doesn't make any sense. Right? How do we know Pesach is more strict? Because it's Isur karet. If you don't eat the korban Pesach, you get karet. So that makes it much more strict than maaser, which doesn't have karet associated with it. So now, Amrle, Rav Sheshet's answer is very simple. He says, Tani Tua, let's learn it from the following Mishnah. Mishna Bikurim, we're now going to learn a few Mishnayot and Bikurim. Bikurim are the first fruits that you bring to the temple, you give to the Kohen eats them, and so it's similar to truma, and you make a declaration, which is similar to maaser, right, where there's this declaration that you say, we're all familiar with it because it's in our Haggadah, okay, we don't have a tekes Bikurim anymore, we don't bring our first fruits to the temple, but we do say some of the psukim, almost all the psukim, but not all of them, in the Haggadah, okay? They're taken from Dvarim Perek, chapter 26, which is what the person who comes to the temple says, Arami Oved Avi, Vayer Mitzrayim, right? And the whole story, tell a very concise version of the getting out of Egypt. The part that we don't say in the Haggadah is the part that basically says, and now you brought us to the land, and I'm bringing you the first fruits, etc. So now we want to know, we say, okay, the Mishnah there in Bikurim sets up a comparison between, and here, if you have the sheet in front of you, you can see the chart, comparison between truma and Bikurim on the one hand, and maaser on the other hand. We're going to have all these laws that are the same for truma and Bikurim and different for maaser. So the Gemara is going to say, Rav Sheshet's answer is very simply, we're going to see this list and notice what's not on the list. It doesn't say anything about arel. Now, if arel was forbidden for truma and Bikurim, which we assume it is, even though we'll see in a minute how they get Bikurim, we know truma, we've already learned that, and it's permitted for maaser, then it should have been written on the list. And the fact that it's not on the list must prove that it's the same. Okay, that's a simple proof. Gemara is going to reject the proof, but that's the simple proof right now. Hatruma v'abikurim. So now we're going to go through all the list of items. What's similar about truma bikurim that's different from maaser? Chayavim alehem mita v'chomesh. Okay, you're liable for the death penalty. Rashi says we specifically mean if you're impure when you eat the truma. Okay, a kohen who's impure who eats the truma gets the death penalty. You're chayav chomesh. That's if you are a non-kohen and you eat the truma, you have to pay back the value and you have to add an additional chomesh, a fifth. Vasurim lizarim, and it's forbidden to non-kohanim to eat. Vehem nichse kohen. Okay, we're going to basically say all these are laws by truma, but they're also true for bikurim, and this we're going to see later because it calls bikurim in the Torah trumat yadecha. There's a pasuk that lists a whole bunch of things. And it says maaser and vows and all sorts of things. And then it says trumat yadecha, the gifts of your hands. Now they darshan that pasuk to mean trumat yadecha doesn't mean truma. It means the gifts you bring with your hands, which is the bikurim. Because they call it truma, so they assume that unless otherwise known, we're going to assume many laws of truma apply to bikurim. And that's why, even though we don't necessarily have it explicitly in the Torah, all these things for Bikurim, we're going to infer the fact that they're like Truma. We're going to say it's the same for the Bikurim as well. Okay, we're up to Hein Nechse Kohen. That means these items are the possession of the Kohen. What does that mean? So if I give the Kohen Truma, the Kohen can do whatever he wants with that Truma. Okay, if he decides, the classic case they always bring, if he decides to betroth the woman with that fruit or whatever I brought him, then he can. Okay, it's his money to do whatever he wants with it. There's no rules about what he can do with that money. They actually belong to him, which is different from maaser. What do we say about maaser? So first of all, I didn't say this, but obviously maaser, there's no death penalty. You don't owe chomesh to anyone. It's yours, right? It's your food that you're supposed to eat in Jerusalem. It's not a sort of a czar. It applies to everybody. You eat your own maaser. It's not yours. You can't decide what you want to do with it. You can't betroth a woman with it. The rules are very clear. You have to bring it to Jerusalem and eat it in Jerusalem. So it doesn't belong to you fully either. Right? It's somewhat sanctified. It has to be, there's special rules about it. Olim be'echad v'meh. Truma and bikurim, right? Normally, laws of nullification are 1 in 60, right? Your milk falls into your cholent. It's batel if there's 60 times the meat to your milk, you're good. Same thing for maaser, regular laws of nullification. But truma, and therefore bikurim as well, can only be nullified if you have 100 against them. So if an apple of truma falls into 100 apples, it'll be nullified. And basically 100 regular apples, there's actually a whole thing you have to take one out and kind of give it to the kohen, as if symbolically that's the truma, because otherwise you're benefiting from something that's not yours. But basically you can assume that even though there's something of kodesh in there, it's all nullified. So again, different laws. Next, te'unim rechitzat yadayim. Okay, we've learned this many times. Your hands are shniot. That means they can only pass on something. If I touch, okay, we assume my hands touch lots of things. So we assume my hands are tamei. The rabbi said that. Okay, the rabbi's made a gzera. We're going to assume everybody's hands must have touched something impure. Therefore, if my hands touch a food, it can't make a tamei because there is no such thing as a shlishi unless it's truma. Okay, or kodshim, or sanctified items. So truma and bikurim, if your hands touch them, they will make them impure because they go to third degree truma, which regular foods, including maaser, do not. So therefore, before you eat truma, everyone would wash their hands. And that's why we wash our hands before bread. It comes from there, okay? Where people treated things b'kedusha, and we kind of kept it. It's a remnant of that whole halacha. But it doesn't apply to maaser sheni. You don't have to wash your hands before. There is no such thing as a shlishi. Last one, harev shemesh. First Mishnah in Shas, right? When do we reach Shema at night? With the Kohanim nichnasim lechol b'trumatan. Because toveling is not enough to allow you to eat truma, you have to wait till the sun sets. Same thing for Bikurim. Okay, so there's our list. And here comes what we said before. V'im ita, if arel was forbidden for truma and Bikurim, but permitted for maaser, that you could eat maaser even if you were uncircumcised, nitne arel asor behen masha'ein came to maaser. It should have been on this list. So the proof is not from a list that it is on, but from the fact that it's omitted from the list must prove that it must be the same. Comes the Gemara and says, that's not a good proof. Tanna b'shiur. Yes, it's true they made a list, but is that list complete? Who says the list is complete? The list could be a partial list. The Tanna could have left off all sorts of things, right? And that's one. So now, whenever, this is a very common argument, but whenever they say this, they always have to say, it can't be possible. I didn't count, but let's say there's 7 items on this list. Okay, there must be around 7. Let's say there's 7. So if you're going to say there's 7 things and not 8, and there's only 1 thing left off the list, that's not a good argument because it doesn't make any sense that there's only 8 differences and they left off 1. But if there's 9 or 10 and they left off 2 or 3 or something like that, then already it's a convincing argument. So whenever you say Tanna b'shiur, the Gemara always asks this question, Umay shiur da hai shiel. In other words, what else was left off this list? Can't possibly be that there was only 1 thing left if you want to use that as your argument. Basically, what we're going to end up saying is there's really no good answer because Rav Sheshet tried to prove it from the fact that it was left off the list, that an Arel actually can't eat maaser. Comes the Gemara and says, no, it could be they just left it off the list, in which case we really don't have an answer whether the Arel can eat maaser or not. So now, in order to prove it, they do something a little bit strange. The order's a little bit weird of this Gemara. They're going to say, well, I'll tell you where they left things off. They left things off the next section of the Mishnah. Okay, the next section of the Mishnah, in our section, we compared truma and Bikurim on the one hand to maaser. What are the similar about truma and Bikurim that's different from maaser? In the next part of the Mishnah, they do, which is actually the next Mishnah, they take truma versus, okay, truma is shown as different from Bikurim and maaser. So there, we're going to say that there's a list of a bunch of items, and there we have a few items that were left off the list. And that's going to be their proof. Only at the very end of our daf, after we go through what the Gemara is going to do is quote that Mishnah, show the 2 things that are left off the list, and then go a little bit into depth into some of the cases in that Mishnah and some of the cases that were left out of the Mishnah, explain where we get to them, etc. And then Rav Ashi is going to come only at the very end and say, oh, by the way, I'll tell you something that's left off the first list as well, which you would have thought we would have started with. Maybe the Gemara didn't know that, and only Rav Ashi came up with a difference and listed it at the end. So again, it's a little bit strange because we want to see what they left off of the first Mishnah. In the end, they're going to tell us what they left off the second Mishnah, but that's already proof enough. Since these Mishnayot are a unit and 2 things are left off the second list, we can assume that things were left off the first list as well. But again, at the end, we'll get to Rav Ashi, who's going to say there's something left off the first list as well. So here's our list, our second Mishnah. Shiur de katane seifa, as it says in the seifa, okay, and here we're going to see what they left out. Yesh b'maaser b'bikurim masha'ein came b'truma. So now we're going to have a similarity between maaser and bikurim, and not for truma. Yesh b'maaser b'bikurim shamaaser v'bikurim tu'unim hava'at makom. Both maaser and bikurim have to be brought to a specific place. The maaser has to be eaten in Jerusalem, and the bikurim have to be brought to the temple. So they're designated. There's a designated space where they have to go to. Masha'ein came b'maaser, right? Truma doesn't have any, you give it to a Kohen. It doesn't have to be in a unique place. Give it to a Kohen anywhere. Uti'unim vidoi. There's a special declaration you make for both of them. As I said, right? In year 4 and 7, you do this vidoi maschot. And when you bring the Bikurim to the temple, by the way, the Bikurim, you're supposed to bring from Shavuot to Sukkot. You have a special extension till Chanukah if you didn't bring them. But when you bring them, and we always celebrate it on Shavuot, but really you have from Shavuot to Sukkot to bring them. And like I said, and even till Hanukkah with a special extension. Now, these have a special declaration it says in the Torah, right? There's not that many declarations, right? One of them, where the text is exactly what you're supposed to say, is by our case of chalitza. Remember, there's a special thing you're supposed to say. Me'ein yivmi, right? He refuses to accept me as a Yevamot, etc. So maaser and bikurim is another one. Okay, so now, asur onen. Okay, so by the way, when you bring truma to a kohen, there's no declaration you're supposed to say. Asur onen. Okay, maaser and bikurim you can't do when you're an onen. Specifically by truma, there was a drasha to say you can do it when you're an onen because of the zar. So truma again is different from those. The Rabbi Shimon matir. Okay, there's a debate. Okay, in a few cases between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis about is bikurim like truma for this issue or is bikurim like maaser. It doesn't say in the Torah anything about bikurim and onen. So the Tanna Kama assumed that it goes with maaser. Rabbi Shimon says, no, it's similar to truma. The chayavim bibiur, and you have to destroy it. This is when you have the maaser beyond its designated time, you're supposed to, right on year 4 and 7, you're supposed to get up and burn whatever maaser you have left. Likewise, the bikurim, you're supposed to burn. For Rabbi Shimon poter, Rabbi Shimon says, no. Okay, you don't have to burn the bikurim. Ve'ilu, now that's the Mishnah. So again, we have this list of differences. We're looking for things that are not on this list. So now they say, one second. Okay, so now we say what's off the list. Ilu asur leva'er mehem betum'ah. That's the first one, which is if they become impure. Okay, the maaser and the bikurim, you're not allowed to burn them and use the fire for anything to benefit from. Truma that gets disqualified, okay, tameh, impure, you're allowed to burn, first of all, you have to burn it, and you're allowed to benefit from the fire, okay? You can't benefit from the fruits themselves, but you can use the fire for cooking, okay? Let's say it's oil, you can put it up and put it up with a fire, and you're allowed to use it. So we're going to see where we get this from about maaser, and then again, right, how we know bikurim also. And a second thing that was left off the list is if you eat them, tumat atzma means when they are tameh, right? There's two issues. One is you're impure, and one is the item is impure. So if the maaser, sheni, or the bikurim become impure, then you get lashes if you eat them. Masha'en came with truma. Now, truma, you're not allowed to eat if it becomes impure. But it never says in the Torah that there's a lo ta'aseh associated with it, and a negative commandment. We're going to learn that they learn it from a mitzvah aseh, from a positive language. They're going to derive that it's obvious that you can't eat it if it becomes impure. But that's what we call an alav haba michlal aseh. We've seen this many times. A negative commandment that's derived from a positive commandment. The status is it's like a status of a positive commandment, which means there's no lashes. In order to get lashes, it has to be a negative commandment. Okay, so now we're at the top of Amud Bet. And we're basically saying these are the two things, okay? Masha'en came with truma lo katane, and it doesn't say in that Mishnah these two things. Masha'en came with truma, right? They're just not on the list. So alma tanna v'shir. From there we get our answer. Again, it was for the response to Rav Sheshet. You can't prove it from this Mishnah. The fact that it's not listed, you can't say Arel must be forbidden like truma because it's not listed in the differences. Because here are two examples that were left off the second Mishnah, and therefore we can assume there must have been things left off the first Mishnah as well. Now we're going to go into some detail of some of the things mentioned in the second Mishnah. Asurim le'onen v'Rabbi Shimon matir. So now we want to figure out why there's a debate between Rabbi Shimon and Tanna Kama about an onen. Is onen forbidden to eat bikurim or not? It's all derived from this verse. Minale dichtiv lo tuchal le'echol b'sha'arecha maaser degancha v'tichosha v'yitzarecha. Okay, this is a pasuk. It's describing you can't eat in your gates the maaser of your dagan, tirosh, yitzar, right? That's the three things you chayav maaser from the Torah: your grains, your grapes, and your olives. Okay, the wine and the olive oil. Ubechorot b'karecha v'tzonecha v'chol nidarecha asher tidor v'nidvotecha. Okay, and the bechor, the firstborn of your animals, right? It has to go to the temple and given to the Kohen. Your nidarim and your nidavot have to go to the temple also, right? Maaser can't be eaten in your gates because you have to bring it to Jerusalem. And at the end of that pasuk, it says, utrumat yadecha, and the gifts you bear with your hands. So again, what do they say that means? Where you can't eat it in your gates because what do you have to do? You have to bring it to the Kohen. It must be talking about the bikurim. Okay, so they say, Amar Mal, somebody says, Trumat yadecha elu bikurim. Now, if bikurim are in the same verse as maaser, we're going to do what's called a hekesh. This is when two things are juxtaposed. We're going to say what's true for one is true for the other. So mama itkash bikurim lemaaser. That means there's a hekesh between them. Ma maaser asur onen, bikurim asur onen. Just like maaser is forbidden to an onen, likewise bikurim are forbidden to an onen. So that's how they get right. It's funny because we compare bikurim to truma, and we said bikurim is called truma yadecha, and therefore it's like truma. But now we're saying because it's truma yadecha, it's actually similar to maaser. Comes Rav Shimon and he says, truma kalin rachmana. No, it's more similar to truma because it's called truma yadecha. He doesn't disagree that truma yadecha refers to bikurim, but he says, why do they call bikurim truma yadecha? If not to say when there's a conflict, right? That maaser says one thing and truma says the other. We're going to learn from truma and not from maaser, and that's why he thinks the law is like truma and it's an onen is going to be permitted. Okay, so ma truma muteret laonen, ap bikurim mutar laonen. So you can see this struggle between, on the one hand, there's a hekesh in the pasuk from there to maaser, and that's Tanakama. Comes Rav Shimon and says, no, it's called truma, so it's going to be more similar to truma than it is to bikurim. And that's, by the way, the basis, that it is to maaser. That's the basis for what we started with when we said all these similarities of bikurim to truma was all based on this. It's just when you get into a bit of a conflict here, right? So there's a debate. So now they say, v'chayavim b'bi'ur. Okay, same thing here. It's going to be the exact same machloket. According to Tanakama, you have to do bi'ur of the bikurim. You have to destroy it at a certain point. Rabbi Shimon poter, he says no. So again, bi'ur is clear from maaser. There's no bi'ur by truma. So again, you're going to have the exact same thing. Mar savar makish or mar savar lo makish, right? The whole question is, do we compare it to maaser because they're in the same verse, the bikurim and the maaser, or do we say, no, it's called truma, so we're going to have the same laws as truma? Now we want to get to the laws mentioned at the end, the ones that weren't in the Mishnah. So first we're going to start with the first one. You can't destroy them when they're, right? You can't benefit from them when they're impure. Okay, you can't light a fire and use the fire for the maaser and the bikurim. Again, masha'en came betrum. So how do we learn this? Minalan ditanya. It says in a Braita, Rabbi Shimon Omer, lo bi'arti mimenu b'tamei. This is another part of the vidoy maaser, the declaration we say when we burn the maaser at the end, right, in the 4th year and the 7th year. So Rabbi Shimon says, let's learn from the verse. It says, lo bi'arti mimenu b'tamei. Right? You make this confession. I did not destroy it when it was tamei, meaning, right, I didn't light up a fire. So there you see it's obviously forbidden. Ben shani tamei v'hu tahor, ben shani tahor v'hu tamei. And they assume, what does it mean b'tamei? B'tamei could be one of two things. Either I am tamei, so I didn't destroy it when I was tamei, or what it really means here is when the item was tamei, I didn't destroy it. Ve'echan muzhar al achilato eni yodea. The second one, though, that the Gemara mentions here, ochlam b'tumat atzmo lokeh, says, I don't know where we get it from. Okay? So we've brought a source for maaser and the fact that you can't burn it if it's tamei. But I don't know, he says, where there's a lo ta'aseh about eating it when it's tamei. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. Stop for a second. Tumat haguf b'hediktiv. It can't be possible. Rabbi Shimon didn't know that pasuk. If I am tamei and I eat the maaser, for sure I get lashes. It says so explicitly in the Torah. That's not his question. How do we know? Because it says, nefesh asher tigabo. If I touch something that's tamei, like a sheretz, like a dead creature, then vitama erev, I become impure till the evening. V'lo yochal min hakodashim ki im rachatz b'saro b'mayim. I can't eat from the kodashim unless I wash myself in water. Now, what does kodashim usually mean? Kodashim usually means truma or sanctified items. Now, in this pasuk, it must mean maaser sheni. Why? We talked about it full yom before. We started our shiur with it. This pasuk says, right, you're going to be tamei till the evening, and don't eat kodashim until you go in the mikvah, which sounds like you don't have to wait till the evening to eat the kodashim. So we know that if it's sacrificial meat or truma, you for sure have to wait till the evening. So therefore, this must be referring, the kodashim here must be maaser sheni, which actually a tefil yom, now we get to another example of something a tefil yom is allowed to do. Besides sprinkling the paraduma waters, they can eat maaser sheni. So what do you see here, though? The main point that we're trying to say is, if you don't go to the mikveh, though, and you're impure, it says, lo yochal min hakodashim. You can't eat the maaser sheni. So there we have our proof for that pasuk. So therefore, they say that's clearly not his question. What he must have been asking is tumat atzmo minay. If the food atzmo doesn't mean himself or herself, tumat atzmo means the food itself. If the maaser sheni becomes tamei, How do I know that if I eat it, there's a negative commandment and I will get lashes for it? Okay, so again, me being tamei, there's a clear verse. That one, Rabbi Shimon said, I don't know. When you see the way they prove it, you'll understand why Rabbi Shimon didn't know. It's really not so obvious. So they say Talmud Lomar. From here, we're going to learn it from this two psukim. Okay, one is in Shemot Yubet and one is in Shemot Ted Vav, I believe, right? No, yeah, Ted Vav. Okay, so different chapters, but there's similar wording between them, and from there we're going to get to our drasha. It says here, Lo tuchal lecho b'sharecha maaser degancha, etc. That's what we said. You can't eat in your gates, right? The maaser, because you have to bring it to Jerusalem, and then it said all sorts of other things in that pasuk. Ula halanu omer, and a very similar language is used. This says, don't eat in your gates, and this pasuk says, b'sharecha tochlenu hatamei v'hatahor yachdav, katzvi v'chayav. You can eat it in your gates, a tameh and a tahor together, like you eat it tzvi and an ayah. What on earth is this talking about? This famous psukim that the Gemara always darshans them. It's talking about psulei hamukdashim, okay, which means sacrificial meat that gets messed up. The classic example is a bechor ba'al mum. A bechor, the firstborn, is supposed to go to the kohen. But if it has a mum, if it has a blemish, and the kohen is supposed to sacrifice it, okay? If it's blemished, the kohen can treat it like regular chulin meat. It's kind of like a gift that the kohen gets, and he could treat it like regular meat. In what way can you treat it like regular meat? That it even says you can eat it b'sharecha, right? Anywhere you want, as opposed to sacrifices which have to be eaten in Jerusalem, or some even in the temple, but bechor can be eaten anywhere in Jerusalem. You can eat it wherever you want. Hatamei v'hator yachdav, you can sit at the same table with someone who's impure. Why? If you're sitting at the same table eating your meat with someone who's impure, they can touch your meat and make it impure. But this bechor, because it's a baal mum, it has a blemish, and you don't need to sacrifice it, we don't care if it becomes tamei. There's nothing wrong with it. It's totally fine. Katzvi, ka'ayal, those are two animals that don't go on the altar, right? This isn't, you were supposed to use it on the altar, but now it's just like a regular animal. So what's the connection? Okay, where do we get from here to, we want to get to that if you eat something that's tamei, that's maaser, right, you're going to get lashes for it. So they say, v'tana debei Rabbi Yishmael, afilu tamei v'tahor ochlim al shulchan echad b'kara echad ve'enan choshishim. Okay, that's what I just said. When it comes to this psulei mukdashim, a sacrifice that gets blemished or something wrong with it, you can eat it and treat it like regular meat. Even an impure person can come in contact with it. And it says, b'sha'arecha tochlenu, you can eat it in your gates. V'ka'amar rachmana, and the Torah said in the other verse about the maaser, right? It said, lo tuchal le'echol b'sha'arecha. You can't eat it in your gates. So what do they say? They say like this. What I told you there that you can eat, which is like a blemished animal or meat that became impure, because it says there, eat it in your gates. And by maaser, it says don't eat it in your gates. We assume it's referring to the same thing. So what can be eaten in your gates, this sacrificial meat that became impure or messed up somehow, when it comes to maaser, if it gets messed up, it's telling you lo tochal b'sharecha, and you cannot eat it in your gates. That's the lo taseh. You can see why Rabbi Shimon didn't think this was obvious, right? That, because this is not clearly it's not the simple reading of that verse. It says don't eat the maaser in your gates. It's coming to make a reference to the pasuk that's a few chapters later, 3 chapters later in Tefav, to tell you what could be eaten there, can't be eaten here. Tameh, maaser sheni, it's forbidden to eat. Lo taseh, because it says lo tochal b'sharecha. That's the lo taseh that you're going to get lashes for. Okay, that was the main complicated part of today's daf. Otherwise, it's pretty simple. Masha'ain came with truma. So now we just proved asur l'va'er mehem b'truma for maaser, because it says lo bi'artu mimenu b'tameh. Then we had ochlam b'tumat atzman loket. We just learned it from lo tochal b'sharecha, right? And then again, you're going to make the hekesh between those and bikurim. And especially, right, the second one is learned from that pasuk where the bikurim are mentioned with the truma yadech. That's a very obvious one. Now they're going to say masha'ain came with truma. How do we know that it's not by truma? And the question is really going to be here. I didn't really get to it because we're really going to get to it now, which is how do we know the first one, asur l'va'er mehem b'truma, applies to bikurim but doesn't apply to truma? So masha'ain came with truma minalan. How do we get this? Amar Rabbi Avav Amar Rabbi Yochanan Damar Ka Lo Bi'arti Mimenu B'Tameh. What does it say? I didn't burn from this, meaning from the maaser, when it was tameh. That's what we learned. You can't burn it and use the flame for anything. But what does it say? Mimenu, from it. What is from it comes to do? This is like the drasha we saw the other day. Mimenu, like we saw bow, right? It can't eat this, but they can't eat something else. Mimenu yatam of il, avalasam of il, shemen shel truma sheni tma. This structure, by the way, is going to be very similar to the structure we saw 2 dapim ago and 3 dapim ago with those drashot of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, when we kind of did this ping pong back and forth and questions about them. So now we're going to say, from here, you can infer this just applies to maaser and not to truma. Obviously, the problem is, what did we say? It's true for maaser and bikurim, right? So we're going to have to include something and exclude something else. So, in other words, right? So this comes to say, I didn't burn this, but if it was truma, I'd be able to burn it if it became impure and use the flame. Ve'ema, why don't you say, why are you excluding kodesh? Right? Like you're saying, sorry, you're including. Why didn't you exclude kodesh instead of truma? Why specifically truma? So they say, lav kavachomechu, is it not a kavachomer? Ma maaser hakala ma'atola lo bi'arti mimenu b'tameh. If maaser, which is much more lenient than kodesh, which is, right, sacrificial items, right, including bikurim, right, and the Torah says, I didn't burn it, kodesh chamor lo koshken, all of us more so. Kodesh, which is stringent, I would say that, right? If you have to make a scale, it would be maaser is the least, then truma, then kodesh. So the question here really becomes, if we're going to exclude one thing and include one thing, why are we assuming that truma, right? Truma and kodesh, or if you're talking about bikurim, they're really on the same level, the truma and the bikurim. So the question is, why are we doing one and not the other, right? So right now we're saying mimenu comes to exclude truma. Truma you can burn, but it comes to include, you include the kodesh that you can't burn it. Why? From a simple kavachomer. If maaser is a lenient law, and yet you're allowed to, you can't burn it, has a strict law, so something more strict is going to obviously have the strict law. So now they say, ihachi trumanami kavachomer, right? If you're going to make a kavachomer, anything more strict than maaser, forget this drashab mimedu, just say maaser is lenient, and yet it has this strict law. So this strict law must apply to anything more strict, more stringent than the maaser, which would include kodesh and truma. To which the Gemara says, haktiv mimenu, but we have a drasha, and the drasha obviously has to exclude something. So let's say it excludes truma. So the obvious question, why did you assume truma is excluded and not kodesh? You could have said it excludes kodesh. So the obvious answer, right? This is just like we saw the other day. Mistabra kodesh lo mematinan sheken pankachas. Okay, that's what we call Rashi Tevot, an abbreviation for 6 ways in which kodesh is more strict than truma. In what way is kodesh more strict? Right, we're talking here about sacrificial meat, pigul, right? We have this law that if you have the wrong intent, we'll get to all this when we get to zvachim, you have the wrong intent when you're doing a sacrifice, it messes up the korban. Okay, we'll talk about all the details of what that is when we get there. Notar, if you leave over the meat beyond the designated time. Okay, both pigul and notar, you can't eat the meat once this happens. Okay, and you get karet for it. Korban, it's a korban. What does that mean? So what? I mean, what it's saying? It is a korban? No. Korban means lahakriv laHashem. It goes to God as opposed to truma, which goes to kohanim. Me'ila. Me'ila is a law of misuse of consecrated property, which only applies to kodesh. It doesn't apply to truma. There's no laws of me'ila. Me'ila is a strict law where you have to add a fifth to it and return the value and add a fifth, and you have to bring a special korban called asham me'ila, the guilt offering. Karet. You get karet for misuse of the kodesh, but you don't get karet for truma. Asur onen, and it's forbidden when you're an onen to eat sacrificial meat. Right? If you remember the whole thing with Aharon, he was told don't leave the temple, right? But everyone else, if they're an onen, they have to leave the temple. Only the kohen gadol does. Regular kohen has to leave the temple. They can't eat sacrificial meat. So basically, these are 6 things that are more strict about kodesh, sacrificial meat, right, and items, rather than truma. So therefore, if we're going to exclude one and say the law is going to be more lenient by one of them, because the law of the lo bi'arti mimenu b'tameh is true for one of them, it's going to be true for kodesh, it's not going to be true for truma. To which the Gemara says, again, exact same structure we saw the other day, adrava, you could say the reverse. Truma lo mematina, we can't exclude truma, it should have the strict halacha, shekem machpaz, okay? Notice this is 4, the other one was 6. What's machpaz? Mita, the chomesh, ve'en la pidyon, v'asura lezarim. Number 1, mita, you get the death penalty. You don't get karet, but you do get death in the hands of God, right? If you eat it when you're tameh, we saw that before. Chomesh, if you're a non-Kohen who eats it, you have to pay an extra fifth. Ein la pidyon, it can never be redeemed. It has sanctity of truma forever. You can't redeem it like you can redeem maaser, for example. Even a korban, if it gets just right, if it has a mum, you can redeem it. We just saw that, or you can actually treat it like a hekdesh. Anyway, like a chulin. Ve'asura lezarim, and it's forbidden for non-kohanim. Kodesh, right? I can eat my own sacrificial meat. Let's say a korban shlamim, I can eat it myself, right? As opposed to truma, which can only be eaten by kohanim. So again, the Gemara answers, Hanach niftishan. There's longer, right? It's 6 versus 4. So therefore, that has 6 stringencies. This only has 4. Therefore, no need to, right? We can't. That's why we're going to exclude truma and include, right? Have the stricter law for kodesh. Or ibait emak karet adifa. If you're going to compare mita and karet is obviously more strict. So therefore, we're going to, again, the one that's going to be more strict is the kodesh, and the one that's going to be more lenient that's excluded from this law is going to be truma. Okay. Now, now we want to get to, how do you know that if you eat truma when it's tameh, you don't get lashes? So, milku delolake haisturika. So first of all, you can't say, how do we know you don't? You'd have to go through every single pasuk in the Torah and say, see, it's not here. Okay, so we're not going to do that. But what do they say instead? They say, okay, we get, granted, there's no pasuk. But it does sound like you don't get lashes, but it is forbidden, right? You can't eat truma when it's impure. Where do we get that from? Minam. Amar kra, b'sha'al recha tochlenu, lezeh v'lo acheh. Remember by the Bechor Balmum, we said if you have a firstborn animal and it has a blemish, so you can eat it. You don't have to worry if it's tameh. You can eat it even if it's tameh. So that is coming to say, b'sha'al recha tochlenu, to eat it, meaning only this can be eaten if it's tameh. But if it's truma that became tameh, you can't eat it. So the lava b'michlal aseh, and here you have it. It's a negative, right? You learn from here that you can't, but it's derived from a positive formulation. Therefore, it's going to be treated like a positive commandment, because any negative commandment that's learned derived out from a positive commandment, it has the status of a positive commandment. You wouldn't get lashes for it. Very last thing for today. Now we finally get back to the answer we were looking for. Let's just do a very quick review. What we did basically today was we had a question. They asked Rav Sheshet, what's the status of an aral with maaser? He tried to prove it from the Mishna Bikurim, which left out the aral case, which must mean the aral is similar to, right? Just like it's forbidden for truma and bikurim, it's going to be forbidden for maaser as well. Comes the Gemara and says, no, they just left things off the list. What things did they leave off the list? Well, not in this Mishnah, but they left things off the next Mishnah. And that was these last 2 things we just discussed, which is about burning it and about eating it if it's impure, that you get lashes, right? Which is not true for truma. Now, which we just proved how we know it's not true for truma. Now comes Rav Ashi and says, I'm a Rav Ashi, Miresha Nami Shmat Minei de Tanna B'Shiur. I'll tell you something they left off the first Mishnah, which was comparing truma and bikurim versus maaser. What is that? Midelo katane nohagim b'shar shnei shavua ve'en lahem pidyon ma she'en kein b'maaser shma mina. Here's 2 more things. Truma and bikurim is every single year of the Shemitah cycle, whereas maaser, we already said, is year 1, 2, 4, and 5. So that's already another difference. And ein lahem pidyon maaser sheni, you redeem. You can't redeem the bikurim. You can't redeem, right? You have to bring them to Jerusalem. You can't say, oh, it's too schleppy, I can't bring them. You don't redeem them. Truma, you can't redeem either. It's always in its sanctity. So therefore, you see, Shema Mina, there's 2 more things they left off the first list, in which case, again, this goes against Rav Sheshet. You can't say, RL isn't there, and we can learn from that RL must be the same for all 3. No, we don't really know, because it could have just been left out, and we're really left with no answer to the question. Okay, we'll continue on this. And tomorrow, actually, we're going to, okay, whatever. We'll see where we get to tomorrow. Okay, have a great day, everyone. Lag BaOmer Sameach, and we'll meet up tomorrow.